Welcome, everyone. You've been hearing a ton in the Agency Summit so far about growing your revenue. In this session, we're going to talk about how to take that revenue growth to actual profits in 3 simple steps. My name's Logan Lyles with Teamwork.com. I'm joined today by Lubna Qureshi. She's our head of marketing here at Teamwork.com and the presenter for today's session. Before we jump into the agenda and the topic today, give us a little bit of context for today's conversation.
Sounds great. Thanks, Logan. Welcome, everyone. Delighted to have everybody listening in on this session. So, Lubna Qureshi, as Logan said, I'm head of marketing here at Teamwork.com. I've been with the business for 2 years, and Teamwork.com is a platform really helped to deliver profit from every client demand for client services teams and businesses everywhere. My background is marketing through and through, always on the client side, interestingly, but have worked with numerous agencies in my career and very much understand the intricacies of agency life. I am Canadian, but I am based in London, UK now. So Teamwork, let me tell you a little bit about Teamwork, right? So it was actually a company founded in 2007 by the owners of a small web development agency, actually based in Cork, Ireland. Peter and Dan, who are co-founders, were scaling their agency at the time. They were taking on loads of projects. And they found that they didn't actually really have a way to get a good handle on those projects. And they really struggled to keep up with the demands of fast-paced client work. As many founders do, what they decided to do is actually build their own platform to help them grow. So fast forward 17 years now, Teamwork.com is trusted by over 20,000 businesses, including 6,000 agencies globally. What we do is combine powerful project management that you need with easily streamlined operations. And we're the only platform out there built for managing client projects profitably. We have a very strong following among small to mid-sized agencies. And actually, as a result, we really obsess and are acutely aware of the challenges that businesses face, particularly in terms of growing their agency in a way that's actually profitable. So you've heard a lot today about how to generate more revenues, but ultimately what's also very important, how to generate more profit. So really what we're going to cover today is how do you take all those new revenues that you're going to generate or have generated, and how do you make sure they actually contribute to your profit margin? And in this session, we're really going to cover 3 critical processes that we feel you need to get right in order to grow your bottom line. First, capacity planning. 2, time tracking, and 3rd is billable utilization.
What you said there, Lubna, about so often agencies get stuck or plateau because they're looking at the revenue growth, they're looking at that top line. But if you're not looking at that bottom line, I saw some research from the Wow company that said a lot of agencies are not regularly looking at their gross margin month over month, let alone quarter over quarter. And so if you're feeling like, hey, we're growing, but maybe we're not actually growing. As you mentioned, we're going to talk capacity planning, instilling a happy time tracking culture. Many of you are probably already tracking time, but let us know in the chat if that is always going perfectly well or there are some challenges to it. We're going to give you some keys to unlock that and make it better. And then billable utilization, especially from some of the research that we've done, the fastest growing, most profitable agencies really have a handle on this. So with those 3 in mind, let's dive into the first one.
Yeah, absolutely. So capacity planning is really core to your agency business, right? It's defined here pretty well, the process of determining the ability of your business to actually meet the demand of your clients. So in simple terms, I would think about this as in a services business, do you actually have enough people to deliver your client projects? And I think there's a lot of important parts to this, which is how does it can impact how and when and if you take on new projects. It can impact when and how you hire the right people, and also ultimately how you're then leveraging your team optimally and profitably. So I do think capacity planning is one of those things that can really induce a lot of fear. I think, Logan, you touched on for agency leaders, right? What happens if we don't sell enough this month? When should we hire our next project manager? What happens if that team member gets upset when I try to give them 2 more clients or additional projects to manage? How will they cope with that? If you've all been living the agency life, which we know you have, odds are you've all asked yourself those questions, right? So I think it's really important to talk about capacity planning from an overall perspective. As I said, really thinking about holistically about how do we have the right amount of people to actually deliver the client projects. And in our work with agency leaders, we speak to them day in and day out. We meet them frequently at events in order to help them actually profit from every client demand. We've come to realize that there's really a few key components to capacity management for agencies of all sizes. So I suggest let's dive into those today. First is revenue, right? So if you're to prioritize and look at tackling only one of these three, if there's only one thing that you could take away, I would say it would be revenue. So looking at the revenue estimates per individual at your agency. We've talked a lot about growing your agency overall today, but how do you actually bring that back to an individual level? You're in a services organization where you're servicing clients based on the people that you have. It's really important to actually get revenue estimates at the individual level for your agency. That way you can actually see how much money is coming in every month that a particular person is going to be fulfilling. And that's actually a very crucial factor, I would say, in decision making and aligning the business goals that you have with operational capacity. And the second one is really time estimation. So, in order to actually think about what revenue you're going to generate at the individual level, it's actually really important to get an estimation of the time it'll take to actually complete tasks. So, for any given individual in your team, what is the amount of time that they're spending doing a specific task or a specific project? So, I do think agency life and client work in particular can be quite complex, and it can be very hard to estimate that. At the end of the day, it is super important to be able to understand where your time and resources are needed in the short term. So one of the advice that we give to agency leaders that we meet and speak to time and time again is actually to use a time tracking tool or a project management tool that has time tracking built in, like teamwork.com, which can really help your agency team put time estimates onto every single task. That allows you as business leaders to really understand how the work is being done and what amount of time it takes to do the work that you're taking on. And then last but not least, this shouldn't be something that you do in isolation, right? It's very important to involve your people in the process to get their individual perspectives. I think by actively involving your team in capacity planning or resource management or whatever you decide to call it, you'll actually create an environment where your staff feel more comfortable raising their hand if, for example, they need more work or if they need additional help. Ultimately, all of that will help you actually better plan the work and deliver the work and resource the work. I think all of these things aren't going to be perfect, right? Capacity planning isn't black and white. It's an art, not just a science. But be open and honest about communicating all of this without your team. Your goal as an agency leader is to incrementally get better and continue evolving your capacity planning so that your services evolve as your agency grows too.
I love that last point about the individual perspectives. It reminds me of something we've talked about in some of our webinars and the podcast episodes that I host on Agency Life, where folks have talked about with time tracking, it's never going to be perfect. And sometimes you have to sacrifice a little precision for general accuracy. And that improvement comes over time, which is what we're going to dive into next, which is instilling that happy time tracking culture. But just to wrap up this first point on capacity planning, if folks think about this, we had Amber Chemis, COO of a large agency, the Instrumental Group, on our Agency Life podcast, and she shared these three. And she said, really, revenue per employee helps you plan further out, look at hiring. That time estimation looks at the short term, and then the individual perspectives can help you fill in that messy middle. So if you think about those three, everyone, that Lubna just shared in that way, based on Amber's advice, I think you'll be able to, as Lubna said, improve a little bit over time. All right, number two, time tracking. Many of you are probably already tracking time, or maybe you've had fits and starts with tracking time and you struggle with how to do this effectively and how to engage your team. Lubna, talk to us about some of the insights we've gathered from some of the research we've done with agencies when it comes to time tracking and time management.
Yeah, absolutely. This is absolutely core to running your agency. So I would say time tracking is really the beating heart of any client services organization. And without it, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to actually understand if your projects are profitable or if your team's at capacity or they're ready to take on more work. And therefore, whether you should be taking on more or less clients and new projects as well. So we've been doing a lot of research in this space, right? We actually ran a agency time management report where we looked at the trends of over 3,500 plus agency customers. And a couple key findings that in particular I thought were very interesting. 61% of tasks are actually overestimated by agencies. So what that basically means is that there's a whole lot less billable time being spent than expected. and significantly less profit coming in because you're actually not necessarily billing the client for that time. And then 15% of staff are actually logging more than 40 hours per week. So what that tells me is the agency life could be challenging. There are possibly people in your business that are working at flat out and are at max capacity. Should we be concerned about risk of burnout? Should we be thinking about impact on morale? Should we be thinking about their productivity? So those were some of the key findings, right? And then one of the other interesting findings from this was Friday is the most popular day to log time, and 5 to 6 p.m. is the most common time to log hours every day. I think the key thing here is how do you actually get your team to track their time, let alone actually do it accurately? I think everybody can agree that this is absolutely crucial, but how do we actually get our teams to do this and do this in a way that it doesn't feel like a monotonous task, but something that actually adds value to your agency? So we actually just interviewed Deb Andrews, owner of Marketree, a digital marketing agency. She happens to be a teamwork.com customer, and she was on our Agency Life podcast. And we spoke to her about time tracking. I think she actually summarized it really well. She said it all comes down to the 4 Ps that help you explain the why of time tracking. The end goal is actually to establish a culture where it's seen as a valuable operational tool instead of a dreaded micromanagement tool, which I think most of our staff wouldn't appreciate. So let's take a look at what those 4 Ps are, right? So first and foremost, there's payment. So tracking time ultimately helps ensure that your agency is getting paid and basically making sure that you're providing the value you've actually scoped out to clients. So from the client to the agency to the employee, understanding what you're getting paid for your time that you're tracking is critical to getting employee buy-in when it comes to time tracking. The second one is really performance. It's important to share with the entire team how time tracking actually ladders up to everything, right? It's not just a micromanagement tool that we're making people do because we feel like making their lives more difficult or because we want to be big brother. It really does tie back to the performance of the company, the performance that we deliver for clients, the performance of our projects, and ultimately the performance of our staff. I think when your staff and your individuals can actually see that link between time tracking and company performance, and they can see the data and understand how it all works, it's much easier to get them on board and see it as an operational business requirement and a tool that helps them make really smart decisions moving forward rather than another chore to add to their plate.
And that shift in performance, I think a lot of frontline employees within the agency can think, oh, time tracking and the word performance, my performance is tied to this and how many hours did I put in? But it's actually tied to the performance of the client work. And if we can help them go a little bit farther and, as you said, connect the dots between the performance of on the projects and the work that we're doing for clients back to the time that they're putting in, and how that helps us keep an eye on how are we performing, estimated versus actual, those sorts of things, it changes the conversation. All right, so we've got 2 more Ps. Talk to us about potential scope creep. Another word that strikes fear in the heart of everyone living agency life, right?
That is definitely something that rings fear, I think, in agency leaders, whether scope creep or time tracking. I'm not sure which one is scarier, but we'll do a poll afterwards and find out. We also did another piece of research here at teamwork.com to really understand what's at the heart of state of agency operations. So we actually did a state of agency operations report where we found 38% of agencies report that they regularly overservice clients. For me, that was a very surprising number. That basically means that quite often, we're actually going above and beyond what we're contracted to do and delivering basically more than what the client asked of us or what was in our initial contract. The way to get around that is, again, being more diligent with time tracking. That really helps you as agency leaders avoid common situation, which I think longer term actually can damage client relationships based on the back and forth that often happens around scope creep, but probably most importantly can actually also impact internal team morale because the team is constantly feeling like the client is asking for more than what was initially part of the scope of work. So we see a lot of our customers actually using teamwork.com's project budgets, for instance. What they do is that feature actually allows them to notify them when they're almost through their budget for a project. And the reason that's very important is you get a notification, right? So for example, you're 80% through the project, but you've only billed 30% of the work. You know that there's a red flag there. There's probably going to be some sort of issue, and you're going to have to make some adjustments along the way to ensure you don't go over scope. It's going to be easier to have those conversations sooner with your client when you have time tracking data at your fingertips. It's also going to be easier to adjust internal team expectations or capacity planning for that work and any adjustments that need to happen on that project. The last P is professional development, probably a very important one as you look to grow and scale your agency and where your people are at the absolute heart of your business. There's a few points here. Proper time tracking can actually help identify training needs. So maybe there's one individual in your agency that actually has a tendency to run over scope on certain projects or tasks, for instance. Maybe it's an opportunity for you to train staff to be more efficient and effective with their time going forward. You can also help team members develop leadership skills or skills to run their own business someday, get that promotion, do that lateral move, whatever growth they aspire to have. And then there's also an opportunity to really to bring employees into conversations, right? To look at the time tracking and the track time that we have and the profitability and really look at how that all contributes to overall business performance. Ultimately, showing employees that their time tracking helps shape the company profitability is something that impacts every employee. For example, there may be bonuses if things are going well, or there may be other things to consider if things aren't going so well. It's a really critical tool to help ensure not only does your team buy in to your agency, but actually understands how to move the needle on performance as well.
Mm-hmm. Of those four, I think the third one you mentioned, the potential scope creep, and having that conversation with your employees that time tracking isn't just about making sure they've logged their time, but it can actually help them with one of their challenges of agency life, which is feeling frustrated that they're having to go beyond what's contracted for a client. And so having the conversation with them that, hey, we can actually help you not go beyond what you need to and not kill yourself trying to deliver on client work if we are accurately tracking our time. And then the last one you mentioned here was reiterated by Marcel Petipa, co-founder and CEO over at Parakeeto. They do a lot of work with agencies, and he reiterated what you just said there. Share those reports with them on how that time tracking data related to project profitability. Celebrate those wins, talk about those things. It's not a micromanagement tool, but something that can actually connect the work being done to the profits that we want coming out the other side. All right, all of this leads us to number 3, Lebna, the tracking billable utilization. This is something that we've done some research on as well. This is another one of those phrases that I think there's some confusion around. What are we talking about? So let's talk about the what and then the why it's important and then how to maximize this eventually so that you can profit from every client demand, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll explain what we mean when we say billable utilization, right? This is the third area I really want to touch on today. So your billable utilization rate signals the percentage of billable hours out of the total available hours. It's really an essential measure of how efficient an agency's workforce is being utilized and gives a clear picture of time spent on revenue generating tasks versus non-billable tasks, right? In simple terms, how do you actually calculate it? It's always good to have a useful calculation. To determine the utilization rate, you simply divide the number of billable hours worked by the total available hours, and then, of course, multiply that by 100 to give you a percentage. So, for example, if you had an employee who works 30 billable hours out of a possible 40 hours in a week, their utilization rate would be 75%. And to find out the billable utilization rate for the entire organization, what you would basically do is multiply these figures by the number of client-facing staff members that you have. I think this is a really important part because it helps you basically understand what percentage of your activities are revenue-generating activities and what percentage of your activities are non-billable. And it's very important to keep on, probably one of the most important metrics to keep an eye on as you scale your agency, because what you want to do is, in particular with client-facing staff, making sure that they're optimizing the amount of time that they spend on revenue-generating tasks and limiting the amount of time that they spend on back office or operational tasks that don't contribute to revenue.
Makes sense. What does the data show us, Lubna, then about what are some of the common benchmarks when it comes to this important metric of the agencies that we've seen and surveyed?
So this was very surprising. We did a piece of work called the Agency Utilization ebook where we really dug into, well, what's happening with agencies? What are the trends? And probably what surprised me the most is that only 1 in 4 agencies reach their internal targets for billable utilization. So what that basically means is only 25% of agencies are actually reaching the targets that they set for themselves around utilization. And that will, of course, have very significant knock-on impacts in terms of the revenue that you generate, the way that they plan the work, the way that they do the work and deliver the work. So how do you actually measure success? I think one thing to think about here is, first of all, I'm glad to see from that study that we did that there are people that are setting internal targets, even if they're not achieving them. The first step here is, of course, have a goal in mind, as with anything else. First is to set internal targets, right? Get staff to regularly and accurately fill out their timesheets, which we talked about already, including not just what hours they worked, but billable and non-billable hours. That is going to be the key to figuring out this metric. And then set expectations around how much time should be fee generating and why that's crucial for success. By setting an internal billable utilization rate target, for example, it could be 80% billable time for all client-facing staff, you'll make sure that you keep everyone on the right track and deliver profitable projects more consistently. And then the second thing that we recommend really is to measure yourself against industry benchmarks, right? There's many agencies on here today. Typically, what we say is looking for an overall average of 60% billable utilization or higher. In order to set those internal targets, you may look externally first of what does good actually look like. For you, it may be 60%, maybe 70%, could be 80%. I think the key thing here is first having a goal in mind and then making sure your team understands that goal and that they're time tracking both the billable and non-billable hours to keep an eye on that metric. And then it's there, and then from there, you can constantly improve your performance against that target because it is very much directly linked to revenue generation for your agency.
Yeah, it goes back to what you were talking about earlier, that actually making sure that the time we're spending, those client demands that we're answering, lead to actual profits. This is really where the rubber meets the road. And I've recently seen some other industry research that indicates that fastest growing agencies are in this 60, 70, 80% range. There's going to be some variation based on the type of agency you have, but consistently across agencies that we've surveyed, we see higher growth rates with those with higher utilization rates. So start somewhere and then improve over time, as you were mentioning more towards the beginning of the conversation, Lubna. So to recap, everyone, keep in mind these 3 steps as you're thinking about adding on new services and generating new revenue for the agency. If you can get a handle on capacity planning, time tracking, and billable utilization, this is where we see the agencies break out of that plateau of revenue growth because they're actually able to track and grow their profit to help them reinvest in the agency and grow further to that next stage.
As Logan said, by integrating these processes, these critical 3 into your operations, we really feel you can drive sustainable growth and improve profitability, right? Properly scoped proposals, attainable project timelines, more accurate revenue forecasting, and ultimately less risk of staff burnout, which really ultimately means a more engaged, happy, and productive team too, and a better agency life for all.
I love that. Well, speaking of agency life, everyone, we've got some parting resources that we'll drop in the chat here as well. But also, if you're registered for this session, you'll get an email from us with these 4 specific resources that we want to leave you with so you have access to some of the research that we cited in today's conversation and some support for your ongoing agency life. So the State of Agency Operations report that Lubna mentioned earlier that surveyed thousands of agencies. We've got our capacity planning guide. As we mentioned, that's number 1 on this list of 3 things that you can do to make sure that your revenue is turning into profits. The other piece of research, that agency time management report that Lubna mentioned as well. And then if you listen to podcasts or you consume content on YouTube, every other Thursday, I am the host of our Agency Life podcast brought to you by teamwork.com. We're interviewing agency consultants, leaders, and folks who are in the trenches of agency life. So subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts, or on YouTube. You can find that there as well. So thank you everyone for the time today. We really appreciate it. And Lubna, thank you so much for sharing all of the research and the insights that we've been gathering over here at teamwork.com.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure sharing some of our insights and research with you. And if you have any questions, absolutely feel free to reach out to me directly on LinkedIn or hop on over to our fireside chat tomorrow morning at 9:30 a.m. Eastern time. And I look forward to seeing you there.